Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction, and welcome to the first of a handful of videos covering the movies of the animated 80s. This first list is going to be dealing with theatrical releases here in America with some direct-to-video stuff thrown in. So that's going to mean theatrical releases and direct-to-video releases of US productions only and won't count direct-to-video anime or foreign compilations. They may be a separate video down the line. If an anime or other foreign production aired here in the States with at least a limited release, it's fair game. That doesn't include movies that only played one time during something like the LA International Animation celebrations of the 80s, unless they got a further release. I'll probably do a separate video on those. Maybe. Eventually. Also, I'll apologize in advance if I get anything wrong or leave anything out of foreign releases. I did the best research I could here to catch or verify everything on the list played in the US in at least a few theaters, but things got a little murky with some of them. Regardless, if they're an error in this video, I'll probably do a video covering other regions later, so we can discuss them when I talk about them in their countries of origin. I'll probably just briefly touch on them here. Sound good? I'll assume you all said yes, so let's get into it. Oh, and also real quick, I'll let you all know that I did put together a playlist of all the trailers or commercials or segments of as many of these movies I'll be talking about as I could find, so you can check that out later if you want. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, as those things are super helpful for the channel. So the first category I want to take a look at is just simply a quick rundown of any films released that were compilations of existing material. Most of what's in this section will be familiar to everyone, so I'm not spending a lot of time on these. I just wanted to make sure they got mentioned. We'll start off with one of the oldest characters on the list in a film that was actually a remake of a short film from 1932. Betty Boop for President from 1980 stars everyone's favorite flapper and is a reproduction of the Max Fleischer original. The film takes several shorts from that era that had been colorized by Korean studios to air over there, hacks together the continuity between them, and releases them as a feature film. It didn't get a theatrical release, just a single VHS release in 1984, and there hasn't been another since. The first theatrical release compilation this decade was from Looney Tunes, which got several films during this time. 6, in fact, between the 70s and 80s. In the 80s, we got the movies The Looney Bugs Bunny Movie in 1981, Bugs Bunny's third movie, 1001 Rabbit Tales in 1982, and Daffy Duck's Fantastic Island in 1983. All of these were compilations of classic Looney Tunes shorts with newly animated sequences bridging the gaps between them. They also came back in the same format in 1988 with Daffy Duck's Quackbusters, marking Mel Blanc's final film performance before his death the following year. Mighty Mouse and the Great Space Chase from 1982 Space! Took a through story from 1979 series The New Adventures of Mighty Mouse and released it theatrically to capitalize on Star Wars fever, which I guess at that point was Empire Strikes Back fever, or maybe Return of the Jedi anticipation, whatever. The Brave Frog and the Brave Frog's Greatest Adventure were adaptations of a Japanese series that Harmony Gold compiled into a pair of feature-length direct-to-video movies for release in the US in 1985. Because they were compilations and stuck together for American audiences, I'll give this one a pass on my direct-to-video anime exclusion. It's basically an anthropomorphic frog slice-of-life series from Tatsunoko, the studio behind Gatchaman, or as we know it, Battle of the Planets, and despite how the premise sounds, they're not exactly cheery films. Bigfoot and the Muscle Machines and Robotics, the movie, were both originally part of the Super Sunday block in 1985, but both were compiled into feature-length animated films and released direct-to-video that year as well. See the 1985 animated 80s video for more on those. You can also hear more about She-Ra in that video, which along with He-Man was the basis for 1985's The Secret of the Sword. The film was actually the 5-episode premiere miniseries of the She-Ra TV series in a feature film format. Kids that didn't get to see it in theaters when it ran in March of '85 got to watch it as the first 5 episodes when She-Ra premiered that September. Speaking of He-Man, the series also got another direct-to-video film in 1986 with the VHS release of Skeletor's Revenge. It's 3 episodes of the show with Skeletor hosting wraparound sections. Heathcliff also got the compilation treatment with the release of Heathcliff the Movie in 1986, which has the title character telling stories from his past to his nephews, which acts as the packaging for the 7 stories from the TV series that are included in the film. And lastly, Robotech 2 The Sentinels combined the only 3 episodes of the Sentinel series to be made into a single film and released them direct-to-video in 1988. As Commoner Treem23, source of knowledge for all things Robotech, called me out on and I later verified, as if I had any doubts about his expertise, the 3 episodes never seemed to have aired individually and were just released in this format, so consider this an apology for the 1988 animated 80s video. Moving on though. There was one other direct-to-video release from the decade that I wanted to mention that wasn't just a repackaging of episodes from an existing series. G.I. Joe the movie came out direct-to-video in 1987 and told a completely new story. The film split its focus on several existing characters on a mission to stop the evil Cobra Law, with another plotline focusing on a team of new recruits representing several new characters from the 87 toy line, and a third on Lieutenant Falcon and his time spent in the gentle care of Sergeant Slaughter and his renegades. The movie was way darker and more mature than most of the cartoon series, and even had a slightly edgier animation style. It would have been a theatrical release, but Hasbro was scared off by the poor performance of some of their other movies that we'll get to later. As we just talked about, we had some TV series that got some support this year in the form of compilations or direct-to-video movies, but there were several theatrical releases based on our Saturday morning mainstays as well. I'm using the term Saturday morning colloquially, of course, as some were weekday shows, obviously. I'm not going into much detail here, as these are all series I've covered in other videos, but we'll go through them all real quick-like. The first release of the decade to fall into this category was 1985's Here Come the Littles, based on the previous year's series, The Littles. In this one, the Littles' human friend Henry has to move to his wicked uncle's house after his parents supposedly die in a plane crash. Of course, plenty of hijinks ensue before the parents show back up at the end, negating the whole story. Spoiler alert, I guess. The Care Bears actually got a pair of releases this decade, with the Care Bears movie in 1985 and its follow-up, Care Bears Movie 2, A New Generation, the following year. Both were slightly different from the series in that they incorporated a large list of musical numbers. Also, the sequel was technically a prequel and told the story of the Bears' first ever carrying mission. Rainbow Bright also hit theaters in 1985 with Rainbow Bright and the Star Stealer. Interesting piece of trivia on this one, it was co-directed by the French showrunner for both Ulysses 31 and The Mysterious Cities of Gold, and Toei legend Kimio Yabuki, who was a former collaborator of Hayao Miyazaki. Also, the movie's got a 0% on Rotten Tomatoes from 7 professional reviews, which is pretty interesting since it's got a 79% from more than 5,000 audience scores. Next up, we have everyone's favorite Transformers analogs in the form of GoBots, Battle of the Rock Lords from 1986. The movie included all of the best Guardians and Renegades and introduced a new line of characters in the form of the title's Rock Lords, who were transforming robotic rocks. Fancy. They'd be the perfect robots to protect your spare house key. It starred all of the series' regular voice actors, but also brought in stars like Lois Lane herself, Margot Kidder, and Kojak himself, Telly Savalas, as the leader of the evil Rock Lords Magmar, though he disappointingly never asks who loves you. We also got a film of everyone's favorite non-analog Transformers, the Transformers, which came in 1986 as well. And yeah, I'm not going to go into detail about this one. I know you've all seen it. I'll just mention that it starred a ridiculous lineup of talent, including Bender from The Breakfast Club, Mr. Unsolved Mysteries, Mr. Spock, Citizen freaking Kane, and Brave Sir Arthur. Plus, it had Weird Al on the soundtrack and a title track that represents everything about the 80s in a song. Oh, it was also kind of a box office disappointment, coming in at 99th for movie gross returns that year, which is why G.I. Joe ended up going straight to video. Staying in 1986, the year also saw the release of My Little Pony, the movie, which adapted a more musical approach for the property similar to what Care Bears did. It was another box office flop, though, and between it and the Transformers, lost Hasbro around $10 million. It did get a sequel, though, which came out in the form of a 10-part episode in the TV series. Moving on, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore got some screen time in 1987 with The Chipmunk Adventure, which starred the trio and their female rivals, the Chipettes, in a hot air balloon race around the world. A lot of the film's animators were former Disney employees let go after one of their box office fails of the decade. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Continuing on, in 1988, Filmation brought us its swan song feature, not counting the zombie Happily Ever After, which appeared in 1993, 4 years after the studio's death. Brave Star, the movie, is a prequel for the series, telling the story of the initial discovery of Carium and how Marshal Bravestar came to serve New Texas. Unfortunately, awesome as Brave Star is, this one was a theatrical disappointment financially too, and really only played in limited markets, not helping Filmation dig itself out of the hole it was in. 88 also saw the release of Pound Puppies and the Legend of Big Paw, which was turned into more of a musical like the Care Bears before it. I'm noticing a trend here. Not much else to say about this one. It was more Pound Puppies and it grossed less than $600,000, making it another animated failure for the decade. And that ended up being a pretty long section for a bunch of movies I said I wasn't going to talk about. So with those starter categories out of the way, let's keep going and look at some of the other significant releases of the decade. As we saw quite a bit throughout the decade with TV shows, several classic characters returned theatrically as well. We'll start with one of the first animated films of the decade, 1980's Bon Voyage, Charlie Brown, and Don't Come Back. This one was actually the fourth feature film using the Peanuts characters and follows Charlie Brown, Linus, Peppermint Patty, and Marcy being sent to France as exchange students, of course accompanied by Snoopy and Woodstock. It's pretty typical Peanuts fare, but with an interesting World War II backstory about Charlie Brown's grandfather. Next up for classic characters is 1987's Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night, which was produced by Filmation and distributed by Roger Corman's New World Pictures. If you don't know who Roger Corman is, that's a rabbit hole you should go down. Try looking him up here on YouTube. But anyway, this movie was based on the classic 1883 Italian character Pinocchio and follows the young puppet a year after he turned into a real boy. The character gets turned back into a puppet, and adventures ensue. Like so many others of the decade, this one gets pretty dark, and with one of the main villains turned into a puppet and burned to death, and the other straight up murdered by Pinocchio, I mean, pretty dark. Apparently, Disney thought it took too many story beats from their original 1940 Pinocchio and sued Filmation about it, but lost because the original Pinocchio story is in the public domain. Disney probably had the last laugh, though, as the movie only made $3.2 million on a $10 million budget. And lastly in this category, we have Felix the Cat, the movie, based on the original character from 1919 and originally aired in 1989 at the LA Animation Celebration before getting a limited release in 1990. This one was also distributed by New World, who pulled it from theaters after it had a disappointing performance there. That seems to be happening to a lot of animated movies this decade. But moving on, there were several studios specifically making waves with animated movies this year, so let's check those and see if things get any better. Although the studio's renaissance wouldn't truly come until their 90s second golden era, Walt Disney Productions and Walt Disney Feature Animation still had several great releases throughout this decade. The first of these was The Fox and the Hound from 1981, telling the story of an unlikely friendship between a young fox named Todd and a young bloodhound named Copper. This one, as most Disney movies of the time had a tendency to do, got fairly dark. It also had some big names doing voices, with Mickey Rooney and Kurt Russell as the adult versions of Todd and Copper respectively, with Corey Feldman as young Copper and Sandy Duncan as Todd's mate Vixie. Disney's next release of the decade may be a cheat for this list, but it's one of my favorite movies of all time, so I'm going to talk about it. 1982's Tron combined live action and computer animation unlike any movie that had come before, and it was initially conceived as a fully animated film, which further justifies its position here in this video. The movie is about a video game designer that was screwed out of credit and royalties for his games, who gets sucked into a computer after breaking in to find evidence and prove the company Encom stole his work. From that point, the movie takes place almost exclusively inside the computer, which looks like a neon-blasted technoscape. It stars Jeff Bridges as game designer Kevin Flynn and Bruce Boxleitner as Encom employee Alan Bradley and his virtual counterpart, the title character Tron. It was also nominated for 2 Oscars, in costume design and sound, but oddly enough not visual effects. If you haven't seen this movie, you're absolutely missing out. End of line. Disney followed this one up with the release of The Black Cauldron in 1985. The movie is a fantasy adventure of a young pig keeper named Taran and his prophetic pig, Henwin, as they flee the clutches of the evil Horned King, who wants to use the pig to find the eponymous Black Cauldron and create an army of undead warriors. Again, this one also gets pretty dark, but it's a really great movie, and somewhat unique against the rest of Disney's catalog. It's also somewhat unique by being a rare Disney flop, costing $44 million to make and only getting back $21.3 domestically. And unlike the others so far, this one didn't really have any huge names doing voices. The studio's next movie the following year did, though, with Vincent Price voicing the villainous Ratigan in 1986's The Great Mouse Detective. This one, essentially, is a take on the Sherlock Holmes formula, with the main character being the Great Mouse Detective himself, Basil of Baker Street, which should be a familiar address to any fans of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work. It's a pretty good action-adventure, and an interesting interpretation of the Holmes character. Then, after a year off in 1987, Disney released their 5th film of the decade, in 1988, with Oliver and Company. This one seems like a lighthearted movie about cute animals until you realize that the animals in question are a part of a crime ring and are under threat of retaliation from a crime lord to whom their owner owes a debt. The movie follows the adventures started by a young kitten who ends up a part of their group only to get adopted by a rich young girl. What started as cute devolves into kidnapping and chases where the villain's Dobermans get electrocuted on a subway's 3rd rail, and it culminates with the villain himself dying in a fiery explosion when his car is decimated by a train. Disney really had a mean streak back in this era. This one had several famous names providing voice work, including 80s heartthrob Joey Lawrence, rocker Billy Joel, Cheech Marin, Dom DeLuise, and Bette Midler, not to mention animation superstar Frank Welker. Lastly, this decade was the release that I personally consider the entry point into the second Disney golden age of the 90s, The Little Mermaid from 1989. I'll throw in the little trivia tidbit here that this is the first animated movie in history to gross over $100 million, but I'm pretty confident I don't need to recap this one or really talk about it at all. So let's just move ahead. But it wasn't only Disney making animation inroads over these 10 years, as one of their former top-tier animators who struck out on his own and launched a whole new animation studio was as well. Bluth Productions started in 1979 after animator Don Bluth resigned from Disney on his 42nd birthday. He and a number of his former Disney colleagues set up shop for themselves and made animation for things like the movie Xanadu and video games like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. Space! Eventually releasing their first feature film, The Secret of Nim, in 1982. This was a fantasy film that followed the adventures of a society of anthropomorphic rats, several of whom are escapees from experiments done by the National Institute of Mental Health, which is the name of the title. The rats are planning on a societal migration away from the farm that they live on to find someplace less dangerous. Plenty of adventure results from this, involving a farm cat named Dragon, a plan by the Institute to wipe out the colony, and infighting against the factions of the rats. It's an excellent movie, and highly recommended. Some internal restructuring led to Don Bluth Productions becoming Sullivan Bluth Studios between the release of Nim and their next theatrical effort. That came in the form of 1986's An American Tale, which it made in collaboration with Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment. This one is the story of a family of Russian Jewish mice immigrating to the U.S. in the 1800s to escape Cossack persecution, and the adventures faced by the young mouse Fievel when he gets washed overboard and separated from them en route. The story incorporates several social issues experienced by Jewish people of the time, as well as some aspects of Jewish folklore, including the use of what's essentially a golem in the finale to defeat a group of rampaging cats. Bluth's next theatrical project is one that kind of became a legendary benchmark of the 80s, seemingly having been watched by every kid of the time regardless of their feelings about cartoons. The Land Before Time came out in 1988 and was also produced by Spielberg and Amblin, who also brought in his friend George Lucas as an additional executive producer. The story's set in a society of racist dinosaurs, Don Bluth's words, not mine, where the various species refuse to interact with each other, except for the kids, that is, who haven't fully grown into the concept yet. A mixed species group of them end up journeying alone in search of the Great Valley the main character's mother told them about before succumbing to wounds received during a Tyrannosaurus attack. The movie follows that journey and the adventures they face during it, including repeated attacks by the T-Rex, or Sharptooth to use the movie's term for them. It's another film with plenty of dark moments, but could have been worse if Spielberg and Lucas hadn't edited out 19 fully animated sequences and almost 10 minutes of footage from others before the film's release. Whatever they did wasn't missed, though, as the movie became pretty beloved and led to 13 direct-to-video sequels since its release, none of which involved either Bluth, Spielberg, or Lucas. Capping off Bluth Productions from this decade is 1989's All Dogs Go to Heaven, which kind of released at a bad time this year as it went head-to-head with Disney's The Little Mermaid in theaters. It probably goes without saying, but it didn't perform quite as well as that movie did. That's not to say it did poorly, it just did worse comparatively when stacked up against how Bluth's last two did. The movie's about a ghost dog out for ghost dog revenge against his murderer, and got a theatrical sequel, an animated series, and a direct-to-video special. Plus, it had the ever-awesome Burt Reynolds as the voice of the main character, Charlie B. Barkin. Even with that groaner of a character name, the movie was pretty good, and a decent success. It was also the last theatrical release from Don Bluth for almost 10 years. Another studio that found some pretty decent success in the early 80s was Bashi Productions. This was an independent animation studio founded by, well, let's just call him an animation rebel named Ralph Bakshi. He's a prolific creator who's been working in the industry since the mid-50s and continues to do so to this day. Maybe I'll have to do a retrospective on him at some point. I plan to do a series based on production companies, so let me know if you think this should be one I cover. Anyway, in the 80s the studio pumped out a total of 3 theatrical releases, starting with 1981's American Pop. This one, oddly enough, similarly to the previously discussed An American Tale, starts with the wife and son of a rabbi fleeing Cossack persecution of Jewish people. The movie then follows the son, whose name is Zalmi, and his descendants over the course of 4 generations, chronicling their ongoing efforts to find success as musicians. Like a lot of Bakshi's movies, including the other 2 that I'll cover here, this one was definitely not for the kids, as it was packed with adult themes and visuals. The studio followed that movie up with a 1982 release of Hey Good Lookin', which is essentially a more violent, less musical take on West Side Story. It's told in flashback and focuses on the life of a young greaser gang leader in 1950s New York and the events that led to him living a kind of life in exile. The version that was released wasn't really what Bakshi wanted it to be though, as that version had actually been completed in 1975 and was a combination of live action and animation. That movie had been made for distribution by Warner Brothers, and they indefinitely suspended the release because of their discomfort with the subject matter and backlash Bakshi's previous film Coonskin had received from civil rights groups. I won't go into it here, but it's an interesting story to read about. The original version of Hey Good Lookin' though has never been released, and according to Wikipedia, Bakshi's actually disowned the version that was, but the studio's website still lists it and makes no mention of that, so take it as you will. The last film released by the studio this decade came in 1983, and this time was a traditional sword and sorcery fantasy rather than a modern-day story. This one was pretty unique and interesting, as it was a collaboration between Bakshi and fantasy art superstar Frank Frazetta, called Fire and Ice. It's about as traditional fantasy as fantasy gets, too, with an evil wizard threatening the world with giant, unstoppable glaciers, a kidnapped princess, a lone villager out of his element who seeks to rescue her, and a mysterious warrior who aids in his quest. Being that typical for a fantasy story doesn't detract from it, though, and the beautiful rotoscope animation and background paintings make it a really pleasing watch. Bakshi may not be for everyone, but if you want some mature animation with something to say about our society, you usually can't go wrong with one of his flicks. There was one other studio gaining notice for their animated films in the 80s that I wanted to mention here. Unlike the others, though, this one wasn't based in the US. Studio Ghibli was founded in Tokyo, Japan in 1985 by directors Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, along with producer Toshio Suzuki. I'm sure I don't need to go into a lot of detail about Ghibli, as everyone and their mother knows who they are. Well, not my mom, but a lot of other moms probably. I wouldn't mind going into detail, so let me know if you want me to add them to my production house video list, but either way, their first steps into the US market came in the 80s, and believe it or not, actually came 2 days before the studio was even founded. Warriors of the Wind was released in US theaters on June 13, 1985, again by Roger Corman's New World Pictures. This was actually a pretty heavily edited version of what's considered to be Studio Ghibli's true first movie, Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, which had released in Japan the previous year. Well, although Nausicaa was indeed directed by Miyazaki, it was made during his tenure at the animation company Topcraft. Topcraft went bankrupt and closed their doors on the same day Ghibli officially opened theirs. Ghibli acquired all of their properties, though, and rebranded Nausicaa as one of their movies after the fact. So back to Warriors of the Wind. It actually cut about 22 minutes off of Nausicaa's 112-minute runtime, and in the process essentially neutered the original film. It even hit theaters with this poster, prominently featuring 3 guys that don't even appear in the movie, and a tiny pantsless Nausicaa flying around in the background. I actually consider this movie release to be a great thing, though, because it resulted in Miyazaki instituting a no-edits policy for any Ghibli film licensed to other countries from that point forward. Plus, the damage done here was fixed when Ghibli entered an exclusive North American distribution deal with Disney in 1996, after which the House of Mouse produced a new, more faithful dub to give us a true English version of Nausicaa. The first film produced under the actual Ghibli banner, though, was Castle in the Sky. It was originally shown at the LA International Animation Celebration in 1987 as Laputa, Castle in the Sky, and then disappeared for a couple of years until Streamline Productions picked up an English dub that had been made for Japan Airlines to be an international in-flight movie. Streamline released this dub version in a small number of art house theaters, mostly in and around the Philadelphia area in late 1989, which qualifies it for this list. This is another one that Disney thankfully chose to redub in the late 90s, as apparently the Japan Airlines English dub was pretty terrible. And the last Ghibli movie to make its way into American theaters this decade was their happy-go-lucky feel-good masterpiece, Grave of the Fireflies. I am 100% completely kidding about that. If you've never seen this movie, it's the furthest thing from feel-good you're likely to find, as in it makes Old Yeller feel like a comedy. What I wasn't joking about is the fact that it's a masterpiece, because it truly is. So definitely watch it, but don't say I didn't warn you. This one's about a young boy and his sister trying to survive alone in a post-World War II Japan on the verge of collapse. Their father is presumed dead in the war, having served in the Japanese Navy, and their mother is killed in the US bombing of Kobe. Their only remaining family refuse to take them in, or I guess more accurately, end up kicking them out, as they're a drain on already dwindling resources, so they're forced to try and make it on their own. And I'm not going to say anything else about it. You should just go ahead and watch it, as you should watch every other Ghibli movie ever made, for yourself. This one ran in US theaters in a limited 1989 release. And it's apparently Akira Kurosawa's favorite Ghibli movie, so it's got that going for it too. Speaking as we were of a Japanese studio, let's take a look at some other Japanese, and maybe some neighboring countries, films that made it to American screens. We'll go ahead and start with 1984's The Adventures of Pinocchio from Tatsunoko Studios. Again, as I said earlier, the ones famous for Gatchaman. This one actually ran in Japan as a 52-episode anime series in 1972, but its rights were acquired by Harmony Gold, who did what they were best at, rewriting and dubbing it to make sense to American audiences and crushing it down into a feature-length film. It wasn't very well received though, so let's move on to something that was, like 1985's Star Chaser, The Legend of Orin. This one was a collaboration between U.S. producers and South Korean animation studio Youngsung Production Company Limited. I guess technically it didn't have to be included here under imports, as a lot of the animation for U.S. properties was starting to be done in South Korea at the time, but I wanted to wet everyone's whistles for a potential video specifically on other South Korean animated films of the 80s. Because oh boy, let me tell you, they're something special. Anyhow, this one is also somewhat special, as it was one of the first animated films to combine traditional animation with CGI, and maybe also because it was released in 3D. It actually did pretty well, making it to number 6 in the box office during its run. You want to know what it's about, you say? Well, the reviewer for the New York Times called it a blatant Star Wars ripoff and expressed his surprise that the lawyers hadn't gotten involved. So, yeah, that. Let's keep going, shall we? Next came a film that could have gone up in the cartoon supporting films section, but I wanted to talk about it here. It's 1986's Robotech the Movie. This was, like the cartoon it was based on, a film stitched together by Harmony Gold from two separate pieces of source material, the anime movie Megazone 23 Part 1 and the series Superdimensional Cavalry Southern Cross, which had been the basis for the second Robotech arc. Timing on it was perfect, he says sarcastically, as at the same time it was being put together, the far superior Macross movie Do You Remember Love was being promoted in Japan, which meant the producers couldn't use any Macross imagery, meaning no SDF-1, no Valkyries, that kind of thing. That led to there being hardly any real connection between the film and the cartoon that we all know and love. It did get a short test run in Texas, though, where it failed miserably, probably because of that aforementioned tenuous connection to the series. Also, maybe because they left some risque content from Megazone 23 in it as well, which kind of turned a lot of parents off. If you haven't seen this one, I don't think you're missing much, even if you're a huge Robotech fan like I am. There's a pretty great attempt at a reconstruction here on YouTube, another Frankenstein's monster reconstruction on the Internet Archive, which honestly may be the same one, and the ADV Films release of Robotech the Complete Series on DVD came with a 29-minute version that cut out all of the Megazone parts because of licensing. Beyond that, though, there isn't really any official release, and it's possible there may never be because the original negatives of the film were destroyed. I personally don't think the two original animes mesh that well together, but you guys can go ahead and watch one of the versions and judge for yourselves. Our next Japanese import was actually one that received a wide release in 1992, but also got a limited release starting on Christmas Day of 1989, so I wanted to include it here for the sake of completeness. Little Nemo, Adventures in Slumberland, came from Tokyo Movie Shinsha and was based on the American comic strip Little Nemo, and it was actually a joint production between TMS and some American animators, with the American-produced portions even having their own local director. Oddly enough, it spent more than a decade in production after the president of TMS acquired the rights to it in 1978. It had a revolving door of talent involved with it over that decade, including having script treatments submitted by the likes of Ray Bradbury and Chris Columbus. And after all of that, it bombed at the box office, making back less than a third of its budget and resulting in TMS president Yutaka Fukioka leaving the company and signing away his interests in it. So, moving on. The last import of any, well, import I guess. Y'all ever realize that word has two different meanings? English is a weird language. Anyway, the last one I want to talk about was another Christmas Day delivery in 1989. Akira. Maybe some of you have heard of it? All joking aside, Akira is the film that often gets the most credit for launching America's love affair with anime, probably because it brought in a ton of casual fans and an audience that had outgrown all of the Saturday morning representations of the genre. But even though true 80s anime fans can argue that point, what we can argue is that Akira consistently makes anime top 10 lists and even several non-anime best movies of all time lists. So yeah, no one can really overstate its influence and the impact it had not just on anime and its reception in US markets, but on animation in general. Personally, I think it got as popular as it did because Kaneda's bike is so damn cool. There are some great shows coming up in my animated 90s series for which you may hear me mention this movie again. Oh yeah, story summary. Well, it's about a motorcycle gang in future Tokyo, one of whom's a powerful psychic who eventually mutates and threatens to destroy the city. That's about the broadest, most generalized description I can give, but it doesn't matter because you've either already seen this movie or you don't care. I'm relatively certain there's no in-between. So, did it throw open the doors to anime in the United States? Well, it definitely pushed them open wider, and definitely deserves a spot in anime and animation history. Well, we talked about Ralph Bakshi earlier, but he and his team weren't the only ones making animation for adults in the 1980s. There were several other noteworthy releases of that type throughout the decade as well, starting with 1981's Heavy Metal. Produced in Canada and based on the long-running science fiction magazine of the same name, this movie was essentially sex, drugs, and rock and roll in celluloid form. The movie was kind of an anthology consisting of 8 animated shorts and an epilogue, tied together by a through story about an evil orb and the chaos it's caused over the millennia and across the universe. It incorporates several animation styles across those segments, as each was done by a different studio with a different team of animators and a different director. Sorry, but I'm not going to go through each of them here. I'll just say that if you like animation with excessive and graphic violence, plenty of sex and nudity, an amazing soundtrack packed with some of the biggest artists of the time, and a star-studded cast doing voices, then check this one out. Released shortly after that film, and even stranger by comparison, is Pink Floyd's The Wall from 1982. This movie was based on the band's 1979 album of the same name, and was written by their bassist and co-vocalist Roger Waters. It's not a wholly animated movie, instead being a mix of live action and animation, but it's enough to warrant inclusion here. It's a total head trip of a movie about a musician essentially having a breakdown and told using a ton of metaphysical symbology, which sometimes makes it hard to follow if you stop paying attention. And it's not a film for everyone, but it's pretty interesting nonetheless. It's an especially easy recommendation if you're a Pink Floyd fan, and it's obviously soundtracked by the album it's based on, using modified versions of those songs and even one that wasn't even on the original album. Check it out if you like interpretive think pieces or the band's music. Next up on my list, and also from 1982, is The Plague Dogs. This one comes from the same director who made the animated adaptation of Watership Down in 1978, so if you've seen that movie, it may give you an indication of what you're in for here. The movie is about a couple of dogs who escape from the facility where they'd been viciously experimented on and have to survive both the wild, unfamiliar environment and their pursuing former captors. It's a really pretty dark film with an ending that's left open to interpretation, though I personally think that interpretation's fairly easy. Honestly, there's not much else to say about this one, so I'll keep going with our next 1982 release. Sarah, or Sarah and the Squirrel, or maybe Sarah, aka The Seventh Match, is a movie that came to us out of Australia, where oddly enough it went straight to TV. It follows a young girl whose village is invaded by Nazis at the start of World War II, forced to survive alone in the woods after her family disappears, either killed or captured. It's a unique movie that employs a production style of placing animated characters over real-life photographed backgrounds, and although I think it may have been made for kids originally, it got a PG-13 rating in the US for some rather dark subject matter, and it has a pretty complex story, so that's why I put it here. The next movie I have in this category is one that I really don't know what to do with. It's 1989's Popol Vuh, The Creation Myth of the Maya. It's kind of an experimental film, written, directed, animated, and produced by a single person. Patricia Amlin combined animation, narration, and music to essentially read a sort of Mayan Bible that dates back to before the Spanish arrival in South America. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. If it sounds interesting, then it looks like you can watch it here on YouTube, broken up into multiple parts. The first part's on my playlist for the trailers of these movies if you want to check it out. The next category is where I'm putting everything I've got left for the decade that didn't fit anywhere else prior to this point. Starting us out in this well-thought-out section is a 1982 production from Hanna-Barbera called Heidi's Song. It's about a German girl sent to live in the mountains with her grandfather, before being taken to serve as a companion for a rich girl confined to a wheelchair. This girl's father is away on business, and of course she's being looked after by a wicked governess. The pair end up running back to the mountains, the girl realizes she can stand, the father comes back, yada yada, you all know the story. This one's an interesting animation footnote, though, as it's one of only 4 movies Hanna-Barbera made that didn't feature any of their flagship characters. Next up in this potpourri category is 1982's The Last Unicorn. This movie is a traditional fantasy that follows a unicorn, unsurprisingly the last of her kind, going on a journey to find out what happened to the rest of her species. It was based on a 1968 novel, with the screenplay actually being written by the original author, Peter S. Beagle. It was produced by Rankin Bass Productions and appropriately co-directed by Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass themselves, with animation by Japanese studio Topcraft, who we discussed in my Ghibli section earlier. This movie also had a ridiculously star-studded cast, with too many famous names to list here. It's a pretty good flick and a benchmark of the decade, so check it out if you haven't seen it. In 1984, we got an animated feature from Marvel Productions called Gallivants, about a society of ants living in a fantasy world. It's about an ant, or gallivant, I guess, who doesn't think he needs to become a typical worker ant and has to learn the hard life lessons that tell him that he does. Great message there about working hard to grow up and take on the position everyone expects you to, where you can continue working hard until you die. There's not a ton of info out there about it, and I don't really want to watch a movie with that message at this point in my life, so go ahead and check it out for yourselves if you're into it. Next up in 1986 came The Adventures of the American Rabbit, which was a US-Japan co-production between Murakami Wolf Swenson and Toei. It was based on characters from a series of posters by artist Stuart Moskowitz and is about a rabbit with superpowers who moves to the big city to join a band and ends up fighting a group of villains who threaten to blow up the Statue of Liberty. It was generally poorly received and pretty much unanimously panned by critics. And closing out this category is The Brave Little Toaster from 1987. It's kind of like Toy Story, but with appliances, and follows 5 small appliances that have been left alone in a vacation cottage for years. The 5 get tired of waiting for their human to return, so the movie becomes a take on the incredible journey as they set out to find him. I've heard stranger story hooks, so sure. This one was actually pretty well received, and it at least made its money back at the box office. I know it's pretty famous for the era, but I've honestly never seen it and can't say I really have any desire to at this point. But it's pretty easy to find if any of you want to. Unlike my normal animated 80s and 90s videos, I thought I'd go ahead and cover all types of animation in this one, especially as the list of non-traditionally animated feature films was pretty short. The first one here is a stop-motion film from 1980 called Pogo for President, or sometimes I Go Pogo. Pogo is an anthropomorphic possum from a comic strip that was first printed in 1948 and set in a swamp full of anthropomorphs. This one's probably a cheat to have on here because its theatrical release was technically a single screening in New York City before being dropped onto VHS and Betamax rentals through Photomat, which may be the most archaic sentence I've ever said. But it's here because apparently it was supposed to get a much wider, more heavily supported release that the distributor completely bailed on, so it probably deserves some extra recognition. The next one that makes it into this section is another stop-motion film that uses cutouts instead of three-dimensional figures. Twice Upon a Time was released in 1983 and incorporates not just the stop-motion, but live-action and traditional animation as well. It's essentially a morality tale about living life too fast, working too much, and burning out, but told in a dreamscape fairy tale wrapping. Apparently, the film's mostly improvised too, or at least has several different improvised versions, some of which skew more adult than others. It's also the first animated film produced by George Lucas. The Adventures of Mark Twain came next in 1985. It was a claymation film that used the entire library of Twain's work and a prophetic quote he made about his own death to create a series of vignettes starring Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn as they travel through various Twain stories on the author's magical airship. It was actually pretty well received by test audiences that mostly consisted of adults and older teens, but the distributor pushed for a G rating and released it as a matinee film, which killed the mature audience interest. It's available to stream free with ads right now on Prime Video if you're interested, now being July 2023. I love Mark Twain, so this one definitely appeals to me. 1987 brought the Puppetoon movie, and it's done in a type of animation called, appropriately, Puppetoon. The film is a love letter to animator George Pal, who created a series called, again, Puppetoons in the 1930s. The film features Gumby and his friends Pokey and Arnie discussing George Pal's significance and using that discussion as a framing device to run several of his Puppetoon shorts. But that's it. I'm not talking about this one anymore because I refuse to say the P word again. Moving on. 97 also saw another claymation release that went direct to video with The Amazing Mr. Bickford. This is essentially a 52-minute music video written and directed by musician Frank Zappa and animated by claymation artist Bruce Bickford. And that's about it. There's no dialogue or anything like that, just close to an hour of Zappa-written orchestral music and random scenes of claymation. So, yeah, moving on again. Lastly in this category, we have one of the most famous animated films of the decade, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. You all probably already know this one, but it's set in a world where humans and cartoons coexist and combines live action and traditional animation to follow a detective and a Bugs Bunny-ish cartoon star as they try to prove Roger isn't guilty of a murder he's being accused of. It was directed by Robert Zemeckis of Back to the Future fame, produced by Steven Spielberg, and starred Bob Hoskins and Christopher Lloyd in the live-action roles. It was also the second highest-grossing film of 1988 and won 3 Academy Awards, so there's a good chance you've probably already seen it. And if you haven't, well, you should. So because it feels like I've been talking for a long time in this one, I'm going to close out the list by just showing you all the other movies of the decade that I think got theatrical releases. If I do more videos in the series about other countries, I'll discuss these more in depth there. For now though, this is the lineup. you have it. A comprehensive, at least I think comprehensive, rundown of every feature film to get a theatrical release in the United States between 1980 and 1989. I swear it looked manageable when I started, but as I continued to do research, the list just got longer and longer. If you're still here at this point, then I definitely appreciate you sticking with me. Let me know whatever thoughts you had on anything I talked about in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, make sure to check back soon for the next video in the animated 90s series as well. For now though, I need a nap. Stay tuned and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.